African-American folk saying claims that our God can make a way out of no way. Noah, Abraham and Sarah, Joseph, and Moses each persevered with God's help amidst almost unimaginable darkness. Through the narratives of these biblical archetypes, we come to experience our own stories in a more hopeful way than we may ever have imagined. This is a series for those times in your life where there seems to be no way out, and for the times when God shines a light in the darkness, providing that way after all.
Welcome to Darkwood Brew. This is a convergent point where people of faith and other spiritual seekers come together online and offline to seek inspiration, companionship, some encouragement along the way of life's dark wood. I'm here with Dr. Eric Elnes tonight, and we are welcoming tonight Dr. Jacqueline Lapsley. She is an Old Testament professor from Princeton Theological Seminary. And you know her, right?
Yeah, actually a former colleague of mine when I was in the PhD program. She was a couple years behind me, and she is a stunning scholar. Absolutely. Whenever Jack Lapsley writes something or talks, I'm listening. We're really excited about her. I'm also really excited about next week we'll be joined by Bishop John Selders. He is the organizing pastor for Amistad UCC in Hartford, Connecticut, and is an activist for LGBT equality and also for the homeless, and was a lecturer at Yale Divinity School. Some people have heard of Yale for about 12 years, and also adjunct faculty at Andover Newton for some time. So real sharp guy. I'll actually be joining John in a couple weeks in Connecticut, where we'll be holding a Darkwood Brew Unplugged for the Connecticut Conference of the United Church of Christ.
Awesome. He's going to join you there.
Yeah. He'll be actually, he's a very accomplished musician as well, award-winning musician, and he'll be actually providing the music for the Darkwood Brew Unplugged. So, yeah. That's
perfect. Yeah. Well, our scripture tonight, as we continue to follow our narrative lectionary, is on the call of Abraham and Sarah tonight. We have a thorny theological question, right, that we need to ask each of our stories.
That's right, yeah. And this one kind of interfaces with last week. We asked last week, can we trust God, a God who allows evil in the world? This week, actually, Jack Lapsley is the one who suggested this one, Jacqueline. Can God trust us? And that the narrative really does open up that question pretty wide.
Not a question that we ask automatically, I don't think, but a good one to explore. So let's get this started with our Pneuma Divina, and we'll set the scriptural context for our question. Tracy?
Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot and all the possessions that they had gathered and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. When the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord, and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by the stages toward the Negeb.
Is it my imagination, or is this a shift in our discussion about the first 11 chapters of Genesis are directed in a much broader focus, and now all of a sudden we're coming to a complete shift and just talking about one family? Jack, can you give us some background on that shift?
Oh, where's Jack?
Jack here.
Hey, there she is.
There
Welcome,
we go.
Jack.
Hi, Jack.
Hi.
Am I right, or is that my imagination? Is there a shift from the first 11 chapters into this 12th chapter now?
Oh, you're absolutely right. Genesis can be divided into two large chunks, if you will. The first is Genesis 1 to 11, which is the primeval story. That's where God is dealing with the world, the whole world, creating it and active in it and being in relationship to the whole world, as in fact God continues to be throughout. But in Genesis 12, we do see an important shift where God enters into sort of the lens, if you will, zooms in on this one couple, Abraham and Sarah. And from Genesis 12 to Genesis 50, it's about Abraham and Sarah and their family, their descendants. So it's a significant turn in the narrative right here at Genesis 12.
What's the reasoning behind that, do you think? Why would God concentrate on one particular family or an archetypal family as opposed to continuing to care about the entirety of the world at large?
Right. Well, I think God does continue to care about the entire. What we see is in 1 to 11 that things have not perhaps gone as planned. That's really what the narrative suggests. That we see the introduction, of course, of disobedience in the garden with Adam and Eve, and that creates a rupture in the divine-human relationship. Then next chapter, chapter 4, we see a rupture in human relations between human beings, between Cain and Abel, and the introduction of violence. And what we see then is violence being multiplied exponentially then. Cain's descendant Lamech, who revels in violence and just is basking in vengeance. And we see that continue then with the flood. The reason the flood comes in chapter 6 is because the people and also the whole creation have become so wicked, that's one of the words, and violent, that God decides to destroy the whole earth, is one of the most terrifying passages in the whole Bible. But then at the end of the flood, it's very interesting, at the end of the flood, chapter 8, God says, well, human beings are just, that's the way they are. They're turned toward wicked. They have an evil inclination. And so instead of saying, okay, so I really am going to do away with them entirely, I'm not even going to save Noah, instead, God not resigned to evil, but instead adapting to the ongoing reality of the evil that human beings are capable of, and says, I'm going forward from here with these folks that I have made. And I think that's how we get to chapter 12, or the end of chapter 11, where we meet Abraham and Sarah, and the lens zooms in on them. And God is now going to work through this couple and their family for the blessing of the whole world. So the whole world is still very much is what God cares about here, but it's a different way of getting at the blessing of the world.
I think that's an important point to underscore too. That the lens is zoomed in really, really closely, and this family is blessed. And on the one hand, you kind of feel like, like here's this parent that's singled out one of the parent's children for special blessing, but really, and the promise is to create from their progeny a great nation, and which is with the implication of land behind that, and to make their name great. And also, though, that the third piece, where it seems to be where the whole thing is oriented, is, and also through you all the nations of the earth shall call themselves blessed, or shall be blessed. So there is this intentionality. It's not just simply let's heap a bunch of blessing on one particular people. It's the way God has chosen to work out blessing through the world.
So this whole understanding of blessing through one for many, blessed to be a blessing type of thing. How does our narrative then address our kind of missional calling out into the world? What's the missional position of the church as the whole, as it addresses the world in that blessing?
So the church has always understood itself to be grafted onto this election. That's often what it's called, the election of Abraham and Sarah, the election of Israel. And the church understands itself to be grafted onto that election, so that the story continues through the Bible, where Israel in the Old Testament is the vessel of blessing for the world, if you will. And then in the church, we see the same thing. The church is meant to carry that forward as well, to be a blessing for the whole world. This is, you don't have to do a lot of theoretical work in missional hermeneutics or anything to understand that this is the purpose of the church, is not just to maintain itself and to, keep on being exactly as it always has been, but to help the whole world to flourish. So that's exactly right.
I mean, the purpose of the church isn't simply survival?
No.
Perpetuation.
So right.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of confusion about that today. The church sometimes feels like it's in survival mode, but that's not the mission of the church at all, according to the scriptures. But I mean, keeping in mind that God, not just here in Abraham, although this is such a key text because it's the first time canonically you really see God working through the particular family of Abraham and Sarah, for the blessing of the world, but that's God's way of operating in all of Scripture. That's how God works. And you see it, of course, most notably in the person of Jesus. It's through this one man who's, God incarnate, who then it becomes blessing for the whole world. So that's a place of continuity between the two testaments.
Which is really kind of amazing. I mean, that the whole question about can God trust us? I mean, you look at what's come before, and the answer is, well, clearly not. and then the lens zooms into this family then that's going to continue, and the conclusion continues. It's like, really, bless this, trust this couple to affect the blessing for the world. I mean, that's a pretty tall order. Really, if God's going to do that, God literally has to make a way out of no way. You look at, it looks like they were first called in Ur, but you find them like settled in Haran. They only made it part of the way there first, and then God is calling them out again, and they come to the land that they're called to, and there's a famine, and they're like, well, we don't trust the promise quite enough. We better take matters into our own hands and go down to Egypt, and twice there's a narrative of Abraham getting nervous that like his foxy wife will be the envy of all the men, so let's pretend you're my sister because I'm worried they might kill me, to try to take you away as their husband, as wife, and Pharaoh gets mixed up in this. It's just a mess. It's just a terrible mess, before they make it back to the land. I mean, and then of course there's this child. They have to have a child, and Sarah is by this time old and she's barren, and like how we're going to do that? Well, let's take matters into our own hand again. And Sarah suggests their concubine or maidservant, Hagar, to be the alternative route of blessing. And so Ishmael is born. And but God's saying, oh, wait a minute. Every time God's kind of helping, saying, well, wait a minute, let's correct for this. Over and over again, you think, how is God going to trust us? I mean, really, that's a lot of freight to bless the world through such imperfect means.
Right. Especially as we keep trying to take control of it ourselves and make things work our own way. Now, but this...
Not that happens these days.
That never happens, no. But you did mention Ishmael, so it makes me think that this God that we're talking about as a blessing for the whole world through the particular, that's not just a Christian understanding about how God works in the world, right, Jack? This is something that even the Jews and the Muslims both.
First the Jews,
yeah, right,
and then later the Christians, and then also the Muslims. So, yeah, in the Quran, the understanding is that the Muslims are related to Ishmael. Then, in fact, there's more than one blessing and kind of covenantal blessing given in Genesis. It's not just simply to Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, but also to Hagar and Ishmael as well.
Okay. And this blessing is not a one-time shot thing, right? It's something that we kind of live into as a challenge, as well as a blessing for all of humanity to be able to maybe not so much rely on their own control of things, but pay attention to what God is doing. How do you define what that blessing is, both to Christian understanding, Jewish understanding, and to Hagar and Ishmael?
Yeah, I think what we see in Abraham's narrative is, he doesn't really go out and try to be a blessing for others, but he is by virtue of the blessing that he has received. So it's more about, him accepting his identity, and it's a little rough in patches, right? I mean, as Eric mentioned, when he tries to pass his wife off as his sister, he seems to have strayed from the path of really remembering what he was about. But in the ways that he is capable of accepting his identity, he becomes a blessing for others, and that happens through his family, through Jacob, who seems like a very unlikely vessel for blessing of others, but he really is. And it continues on down the line through Joseph and the whole nation of Israel that we see in Exodus and so forth. And so you see, for example, in the prophets, talk about how all nations, this is in Isaiah 2, all nations will stream up to the Lord's temple. Why? To receive the Torah. Now, what's with the Torah? The Torah, which is the law, instruction is meant to be a blessing for all people. That is to say, if you live by this God-given law, it's understood not as something that constrains people, but as something that blesses people. So that just continues throughout the Old Testament and into the New.
Yeah, I think I would want to underscore that point. There's been a lot of great, vibrant churches out there, but also I think almost every kind of dead and irrelevant and frankly just kind of seems a church that seems to have lost sight of what it's around for, still will invoke this, saying we need to be around, we need to survive because we need to be the blessing to the world. And you think, oh my gosh, please don't bless the world like this. And the idea is that we have this thing that we can impart to others in order so they may be more lively. But really, I think that what's going on in this narrative is the way that the world is blessed is, Abraham and Sarah are called, they're given an identity in relation to God. They're called by a love that exceeds their wildest imaginations to conceive, and they are acting in relationship to this one whose love for them is just mind-numbing, and trust in them, believe it or not, is mind-numbing. And in chasing out that relationship between themselves and God, that becomes the blessing. It's an attractional blessing, not simply one that we cast off and impart to others. It's like a good analogy would be with a relationship. Take two people who are in love and they get married and they are thoroughly in love. Their marriage itself creates a blessing for others just through them interacting in a loving way. It creates a blessing for the world. They don't necessarily have to sit down and say, okay, now how do we bless the world through,
Right.
what do we give them? It's like be you in love with each other, and through whom the world gets blessed.
I think that's exactly right. That's what's going on with Abraham and Sarah. When you see them accepting this blessing and not being afraid of what God has called them to do, but living into that identity, that's when you see them becoming a blessing to others. When they get a little anxious, then things start to veer off the path. That's the way it is, though, right, for everybody. That's what's great about Abraham. He's often depicted as, the faith of Abraham as though it were just this, platonic ideal of faith. But when you really read the narratives, no, he's actually somebody who stumbles a few times and is really human, which is wonderful about him and wonderful about actually all the biblical characters.
Yeah.
None of them are ever flawless. So
yeah, there's somebody who, Abraham, I think, you have to read into kind of between the lines and some of this stuff. I think Abraham and Sarah are people who are absolutely head over heels in love with this God who's called them forth. And proof of that is just you get down to chapter 22 and the near sacrifice of Isaac. And you think wow, here's somebody who's like totally bought into this God thing. Well, what would even drive a person to do that? You're so head over heels in love, and we can get into that narrative. That's a whole side subject, but. But bottom line is, they came from a culture that was polytheistic, and here's this love that calls to them, and when they hear it, when they sense it, they just give up all of the gods. And in the Jewish Mishnaic tradition, and also in the Quran, there are these traditions about the idol smashing of Abraham too. They senses this call to this one great love and wants to give up all others. And it says his father Terah, in the Mishnaic material, Terah, his father was an idol maker, and there are these great stories about how, like for instance, he runs an idol shop, and Abraham takes over one day, and somebody comes in who's 50. I kind of perk up when I hear that because I'm 50. Wants to buy an idol. And he's like, you want to buy an idol? How old are you? He was 50. He goes, well, you want to worship something that's one day old? And then a woman comes in. She wants to lay some food as a sacrifice to one of the idols. And so what he does is he takes an axe and he smashes all the idols except the biggest one. He puts the axe in the idol's hand. And then Terah comes and like, what on earth has happened? He says, oh, well, they fought over the food, and the largest one smashed all the others. And he goes, they can't do that. They don't have any knowledge. They can't see. And he goes, exactly. Why are you worshiping these things?
That's great. Yeah, apparently also in later Jewish tradition, Abraham is really remembered as someone who first repudiated idolatry and idols. So it's interesting that the Muslim tradition and the Jewish tradition really come together on this.
Very much.
Yeah. It's not such a pronounced thing, I think, in the biblical witness itself, because they're not. Right. I don't think they're actually that worried about polytheism at that point. But later, that's really an emphasis.
Yeah, certainly in the Quran, that's a huge thing. Yeah. I mean, the Hajj that takes place at Mecca, to surround the Kaaba, that's the worship piece, right. That square piece there. That was, according to the tradition, that was a worship place that was set up by Adam, and then wiped out in the flood. And then who resurrects the Kaaba or rebuilds it? It's Abraham.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Wow. And in fact, Muhammad saw himself, over time, then that the Kaaba became filled with idols and so forth. And Muhammad comes to then cleanse the Kaaba of the idols and to restore the worship to the one true God.
And the Islam tradition even goes as far as the story of the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac is the same in the Quran as well with Ishmael, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I believe he's not actually named, but it's clearly Ishmael who is almost sacrificed. Abraham is really a wonderful point of convergence for the Muslim and Jewish and Christian traditions because you see these parallel promises that are made, promises to Abraham about Isaac and promises to Hagar about Ishmael, that they're both going to be the founders of these great nations. I mean, the language is the same. And then you see in chapter 21, and then the near sacrifice of Ishmael, and chapter 22, the near sacrifice of Isaac. So you have the two sons who are at risk in each of those chapters. My former colleague, retired colleague, Pat Miller, called Ishmael's story the thread, the dangling thread that is in the margin of our text. So there's a whole story there of God's active presence in the life of Hagar and Ishmael that's just not told in our Bible because it's not the Bible story, but it's still an important story that the Bible points to.
Yeah. It's part of giving that the other half of the answer to your enemies that you talked about last week, right? Or to somebody else to be able to fill in the pieces and have that open conversation. But this blessing that we're talking about here is not for us today as we're looking at this narrative. It's not just go out and be nice to everybody else and bless their lives and be a blessing to them because that's what God calls us to do, but rather, as you said earlier, to live most fully into who you were created to be, and in that you are a blessing to the world because that's how God created you to participate in what God's already doing in the world. That's that missional context. Am I understanding that kind of narrative context today?
Yeah, I think that really the kind of this when it comes comes to shove, the way even we relate to this text is in a sense, you fall head over heels in love with the God who is head over heels in love with you, you know, and seeks relationship over perfection. And when you sense that, the God who names you, they're called, they're given an identity. The God who names you, who gives you an identity that is deeper than your own understanding, even, and yet most fits you. Follow that. You know, there's a sense in which God doesn't need to trust. Or rather, Abraham doesn't need to, and Sarah don't need to trust, you know, like when God calls them out of Ur to go to this land, they don't need to trust that everything will be okay, that God will just set up everything and all right. What they're really doing is responding to like, I don't want to be anywhere that God isn't, you know, and I want to follow wherever God is, that's where I want to be. They're so in love. And I think that's, when you start doing that in your own life and in your own church and so forth, that's when the blessing comes to other people.
I think that's exactly right. That's a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah.
So can God trust us? That's our thorny theological question. How does God trust us in the midst of that there is no other choice but to fall in love with a love so great?
Yeah, I'd say that God does not trust our perfection. What God trusts is our response to God's love for us. Yeah. And when we sense that, we can't. It's like when you fall deeply in love with somebody, even if you want to try to forget it, you can't. You know, when we sense that, we start to respond to that. We can be full of imperfections, but in general, we're going to try to self-correct towards something that works out the next step in that loving relationship.
And I think you see that in Abraham and Sarah's story. You see both sides. You see God wanting to trust Abraham and Sarah. But I think it's a little bit tentative at first. I mean, this is why we end up with the near sacrifice of Isaac. Yeah. God needs to know something about Abraham that God doesn't know yet. So as painful as that story is. But the other side of that is, you know, can Abraham trust God? So that also is being worked out in the narrative. I think both are there, and they're like a couple in love who are trying to figure out, you know, is this going to work? As we have all this outpouring of love for one another. I think it's there clearly in the text. And the question is, you know, is it going to work? Can Abraham be the blessing, you know, going forward? So.
So the question about whether we can trust God even in the midst of evil in the world, and then God turning around and being able to trust us, is that covenantal relationship that is constantly renewing itself and helping us reorient ourselves continually. Maybe not consistently, but continually over and over again, we get clues within our relationship with God that this trust and this covenant between us works, and we should keep orienting ourselves that direction, and that's what living most fully into who we are created to be can look like, right? So thank you, Jack, for being with us. This has been a great conversation, and it's a wonderful exploration of the narrative that we've been given through the narrative lectionary. Thank you for sharing your insights.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Are we going to have a question or two, maybe from the internet, or do we have anything?
We can.
Yeah. Okay. All right, we have Tracy has got a question from the internet.
We do have a question from the internet. In our online chat, the discussion has been centered around a question regarding Abram responds by building altars. How do we do that today in our faith journeys? Do we leave altars along the way to bless others?
Great. Is Jack still with us? We want to throw that to her first?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that question. I'm struck by, I don't know whether we leave altars. I'll tell you a story about, or I had a rabbi coming into my classroom. He comes frequently into my Hebrew classroom, and he loves to tell the story of the Jewish interpretation of all those altars that Abraham builds. And the rabbis read, about Abraham's story, and he kept building these altars, but they noticed, and the rabbis were really into noticing the details of the text. So they noticed that he sacrifices in chapter 12, but then it never explicitly says that he sacrifices after that. It says he built all these altars. And so the rabbi said, what's going on with that? He's very wealthy, right? We know that from the narrative. But he's not sacrificing, and the whole point of sacrificing, right, is to show your relationship to God in a very concrete way, to give up something, right? So they said that's why when you get to Genesis 22, which is the near sacrifice of Isaac, that story begins after these things. And the rabbi said, "What things? What things?" And it was, he built all these altars and he didn't sacrifice. So just trying to get to the question about, do we leave altars along the way? I think what we do, and maybe these are altars, but what we do is we're involved in the life of the world in such a way that we are participating in the flourishing of the world. I think that's God's will for us, as it was for Abraham in having the blessing flow through him.
Yeah, I think about that on a personal level. You kind of translating that into if Abraham's story is my story, kind of thing. I mean, not that you can always do that, but I do find that when I sense a special closeness to God or a blessing, or you sense that, my gosh, this God is really real and really aware and really has done something for me. This life is a bit like a dream. It's like coming out of a dream where we might be really intensely aware of that right away, but then it fades. The memory of that fades. Really, it's amazing how fast we go back to life as usual, the status quo, like as if it never happened. And to me, it's really been helpful in my path to kind of create markers, to remembrances. Oh, remember, before you forget, remember, and something that could be accomplished through journaling, but that could also be accomplished through objects that trigger that memory, things like that. There are things that I'll put on my pocket and keep for months, even at times, just kind of calling me back to remembering that. Where that gets goes negative is if you then try to replace, if that becomes magical, or it becomes a substitute for lived experience of God. But if it's awakening you to the reality of God, I think that's where an altar is particularly helpful, or something that's altar-like.
I think that's what the rabbis were trying to make a distinction there between. They were saying, Abraham was just setting up these altars, and they were just kind of, from their point of view, they were just these kind of empty markers, because it wasn't telling us about how he sacrificed, and that it was an actually meaningful marker. So I think that was their way of interpreting the very same phenomenon.
Well, we thank you again for being with us tonight, and Eric, thank you for your insights. We'll hopefully see you back on Darkwood Brew soon, Jack, as we always love having you with us. Thanks again.
Oh, thank you. Thanks a bunch. Bye.
And we have some conversation about our social media, where we interact with our folks that are in our larger community, not just in our coffee house, but the larger community throughout the world.
Yeah. This tonight we just simply want to make note that our blogs are up and running. Again, at Darkwood Brew, if you just hit the blog tab, in fact, one of our bloggers, Leslie Murrow, is right here in the coffee house. She wrote an excellent entry about does God wipe the slate clean like a blackboard? I would love that. And also Ian Lynch, who's been a blogger for us for a long time, and also manages the social media during the live broadcast until you take over.
Right.
He's also blogging, and then I'm supposed to be blogging too. I've been a little bit late at getting my thing up, but that'll be up in the next day or two. So there'll be 3 of us so far who are blogging as well. Check those out. Okay.
That's excellent.
Well, we want to turn to our guest musician too. Every week we feature a different person, either nationally or locally. And tonight we are very pleased to introduce to our Darkwood Brew viewing audience, Mark Irvin. And thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
For our audience, you want to just say a couple words about who you are? Or what you
Yeah, born and raised here in Nebraska, and married 26 years with a beautiful woman. We have 2 wonderful kids. One's 22 and one is 11, so we're on the once-a-decade plan.
Wow.
This next decade may be a little rough. But
I understand you had kind of a backward way of getting into music.
yeah, I didn't get to do music in school. I wanted to, but just the funds weren't there, and found a beat-up guitar when I was about 18 and taught myself to play. And by the time I was 20, I was pretty much on the road with whoever would hire me. And about 28, 29 years old, I decided to try to audition to get into college as a musician, and they were kind enough to let me because I couldn't read a note. Everything was done by ear, and so then it was filling in the blanks. And I've been a music educator now for 21 years. This is my 20th work.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Thanks. Did 14 years of high school, and then I went over to the dark side to the middle school about 8 years ago. So.
Is it true that Carlos Santana said that he credits you with teaching him everything he knows about guitar?
No, again, if that were true, I would be driving a much nicer vehicle.
Oh,
so.
Okay. All right. Well, what song do you have to offer us tonight?
This is one I was asked to write for a wedding, and I'd written a couple of the wedding tunes before, and they're difficult to write. With trying not to be schmaltzy but sincere. And a friend of mine said, "Why don't you?" Because I was struggling with it. He said, "Why don't you write this about you? Nobody has to know, and your wife's relationship." And it was perfect. So this is called "Fly With Me."
Cool. And after the music, by the way, we will be starting the Brew Who, which is about 20 minutes or so of conversation between yourself and myself about it could be about the text tonight, and also about any other subject that you may have brought with you about theology, God, the Bible, Jesus, Abraham, what have you. And I won't necessarily answer those, but we could bring them up.
I've lived like an eagle glides across the sky. I'd fly and ride the currents way up high and let them take me where they might. But now I have direction and a plan. I see the strength within your eyes. I'm asking for your trust in mine. To fly with me, we'll spread our wings of hopes and dreams, set our love soaring free. Fly with me, we'll take flight and won't lose sight of what our love is meant to be. Fly with me. If we will take this leap of faith hand in hand, I know the wind will never blow so cold through the fires of our one soul. Spread our wings of hopes and dreams, set our love soaring free. Fly with me. We'll take flight and won't lose sight of what our love is meant to be. Fly with me across the vivid sky. Fly with me with passion through the flight. Fly with me from morning's first light until the sunset burns and dies. A sign. I wasn't looking for any signs, but now when I see an eagle fly, thoughts of you fill my mind. So won't you fly with me? Spread our wings of hopes and dreams, set our love soaring free. Fly with me. We'll take flight and won't lose sight of what our love is meant to be. Fly with me. Fly with me. Fly with me. Thank you.
All right. So welcome to the second half of the program, the Brew Ha, which is going to be live and interactive conversation. And let's start things up. I know we've got some questions that are brewing in the coffee house, but also there's been some that are already kind of surfaced online. Tracy, why don't you
Actually,
start us out?
actually, the first question is one from in the room, and the question is, if God created humans with full emotion, why would God be surprised those same humans are violent?
If God created humans with full emotion, why would God be surprised if we're violent? Mm-hmm. All right. Anybody want to take a stab at that? You're going to leave me out hanging, huh?
I doubt there's any real surprise.
Yeah. Well, actually, I was really taken by the interpretation in the Quran, actually, which I think actually provides a helpful, maybe corrective to some over-interpretation of what was going on in our own tradition with respect to our creation and the surprise that God would have. I mean, I think the creator of the universe is probably intelligent enough to know that that which God has created is going to have some problems. That it's not just like suddenly like, oh my gosh, I never imagined that humans would have some failings. Here in the Quran, as we talked about last week, there's actually from the very beginning a note that God created beings which are from the get-go imperfect, from the get-go limited in knowledge, from the get-go actually. I mean, the angels even say when God says, look at my creation, let's bow down before them. They're saying, well, wait a minute. I mean, we praise your name constantly, but these people, they're going to like do evil and shed blood. And I think that's a more that understanding is much more sophisticated in that sense, and mature or enlightening in the sense that God knew what God was getting into when God created the likes of us. And there's something about our limitations which actually serve God's purposes in the world. And the angels are all afluster in the Quran about this. And God says, listen, I know stuff that you don't, quite frankly. And they trust that. And I think that that's really what we are called to do. And we did a whole series, actually, a couple of years ago called Failing, Falling, and Flying, in which we took on this idea of original sin. We confirmed it. I mean, the Quran confirms it. The Bible confirms it. We are prone towards having a problematic existence. We are marked by original sin, to be sure, but we're also marked in our own Bibles by original blessing. But neither the sin nor the blessing defines us. What we're defined by is grace. And if you look at those first 11 chapters of Genesis, every single story, without exception, confirms that pattern. We are marked by blessing. We are marked by challenging that blessing in our sin. But ultimately, the relationship that we have with God, with each other, and with the earth is defined by original grace.
Our next, actually it's a comment from our online chat community. It seems that we try to be something we think we should be instead of being who God wants to be in relationship with, that is really our true selves. Could you comment on that?
Well, I'm going to throw it back out to you. What do you guys think? Oh, everybody's going to be quiet. Yeah.
What's the question again?
It seems that we try to be something we think we should be instead of being who God wants to be in relationship with, that is our true selves.
Yeah.
I have something to say about that.
Yeah. Let's go to actually our Darkwood Brew producer in here for a few days from Tucson, Arizona, Scott Grissell.
Thanks. It's good to be here. You know, it puts me in mind of the thought that it seems, and this is just from personal experience, I can't verify this for anybody else or other than what I've seen, but it seems to me that fairly deep within us, we have a sense of who we are. Sometimes we get around it, we get kind of close to that, and that we can know when we're sort of approaching that, and we can know when we're sort of moving away from that. And it's a subtlety. It's not, sometimes it seems like it's very clear, and sometimes it seems like it's not that clear at all. And I think to me that those are the times really for us to sort of stop and assess, because I think if what you were talking about earlier in the episode has some truth to it and has some merit to it, then what this God that we totally don't understand has put forth is this idea that, you know, you actually are here for a reason, and there are some things that you're here to be about doing, and they may not be exactly the same thing that your neighbor's doing. As a matter of fact, they're probably not the same thing, and in some cases they may almost seem like the opposite of what your neighbor's doing, and that those things are okay. And so for me to think about that question and answer it, I have to do sort of a dual, I have to take a dual look, and it's, does this seem to square with my sense of what's right, and at the same time to know that I may never have a big enough picture for that to be enough to answer the question. I always need to be looking outside of myself to find that. So I don't know, that may be an oblique way around that question a little bit, but that's what occurs to me. So.
By the way, just FYI, how we work this, the reason why the camera is not on the respond, although we did go to Scott because he's a producer, but the camera during the brouhaha, we keep the camera off of our audience so people can be anonymous if they want. We wouldn't let Scott do that, but everybody else can. That's why you're looking at my dumb face while people are commenting. Anybody else comment about that? Follow up? I think that oftentimes we get into trouble. The biggest trouble we get into is when we have this image of the idealized self, and oftentimes that's formed by other people we see in their lives, and our impression that their lives are running easier than ours, which is rarely the case, but we have that impression. And we kind of form this idea of what the idealized self can be. But normally that idea of the idealized self is an image that's too small for us to actually live freely within. And so I remember, I've told a story in my next book about this time I was interviewing before a church years and years ago that I really wanted to be the minister of. And I was really intimidated because the church was this really big church, and the only church I'd served before I went to that interview was as a part-time interim minister of a church of 25 people, and this church was like 900 members. And I'm like, there's no way they're going to accept me for who I am in my very limited awareness of like how to run a big church or anything like that. And so I studied and studied and studied to make sure that I knew the answer to any question that could come, so I could project this image of like the perfect minister who was always in control, always knew what he was talking about, never flustered. And I pulled that off. I mean, I did the interview and I was like I was, as Tony Campolo says sometimes about his own preaching, I was taking notes on myself. You know, I was like, wow, this is awesome. I had all the answers. Bing, 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 bing. You know, I'd anticipated, in fact, all their questions even. You know, I just came up with all the right answers. I didn't get the position, and I was devastated. And I called the search committee chair and asked her, you know, because I knew she was kind of in my camp, and I said, you know, I'm going to have other churches, you know, interviews. Is there anything I should know about that, of what happened? And I only missed it by 2 votes, but she kind of paused.
Good to know.
She paused, and I could tell she was like considering, like wanting to answer me honestly rather than just giving me some flip answer. And there's just kind of pause, and she says, "You could have been less confident."
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And it's like, absolutely, it just went right through me. It's like, of course, I kind of had this image of the minister who is only loved to the extent they're perfect. And that's not the kind of minister they're looking for. They're looking for a real person, someone who didn't necessarily know all the answers. They wanted to have somebody who had something going on. But, and so I really took that to heart. And the next congregation that I really felt that sense of call to, when they were interviewing me, you know, I was myself. And the image I was responding to was somebody who was loved for who they are and their relationship with God. And sure enough, that turned into a love relationship for 13 years with that congregation.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm tempted to ask you if you're acting now.
I'll just say right now, I don't know diddly about most things. So, yeah. Okay, we have another question. Yeah.
Well, actually, I just wanted to add, you know, you were saying earlier, you know, that Abraham was doing, you know, he and Sarai made the journey they made out of love for God, out of being, you know, in love with God. And I hadn't really thought of it like that. I'd always, you know, I'd grown up with that story thinking of it as being about obedience. Mm-hmm. You know, but if it's about love, then they're being who they are, and they're doing what they were doing because of that.
Yes.
And that also gets me thinking about the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, you know, he says, don't worry about your life. So, you know, that God feeds the birds. Mm-hmm. And what I've long understood that to mean is that, you know, that if you're doing if you're being who you are and doing what God has made you to be, it's not a promise of an easy life, mm-hmm. but it's a promise that God is there with you and will care about you.
Yes.
You know, and will try to make doors open, you know, that you can open.
Yeah. You know, I think a very profound set of theologians known as Gladys Knight and the Pips had something to say about that. You know, there's a song they did called "Midnight Train to Georgia," and
are you gonna sing?
No, no, that's another thing I can't do. no. There's this one line.
Guitar.
There's this one line of it, and actually, the funny thing is we were talking about this text in the worship plan, the Darkwood Brew planning team, and both Chris and I had independently thought about this song in the relation to that, and the line from the exact line that we're both thinking of was,
"I'd rather live in His world than live without Him in mine."
I'd rather live in His world than live without Him in mine, and I think that is that kind of love that draws people out of their comfort zone. It's not like they think, okay, everything's going to be fine. I've had the assurance that I'll only be successful and things will only ever go my way and I won't be hurt. It's like, come hell or high water, I want to be where God is, and I want to be where my identity is with God. And that idea of being in love with God is not simply an abstraction, like, you know, submit to this deity that's removed from us and so forth. This is a God who calls us by name, who knows us for who we are. And I think there's a really great analogy in human relationships again between the lover and a beloved. I think about, for instance, there's this great poet, William Butler Yeats. Some people have heard of. You know, there was a time in his life, as a young poet, he comes into goes to this party, and he's some people he wants to go, and he's got some really exciting stuff to poetry or something to impress them over. But in this crowd, there's this one woman. Her name was Maud Gonne, and she just stuns him. Just stuns him. She's standing next to this vase of apple blossoms, and he forgets everything. He forgot even the reason why he's at the party. And suddenly the whole world is just simply her. And he ends up kind of chasing after her for the rest of his life. He actually proposed 3 times to her. She turned him down all 3 times. But he writes this poem called The Wandering Angus that kind of describes the effect of that love. And the poem, I think, serves as a really fitting analogy to what happens to us between ourselves and God as well. And so I could read a poem. I can't sing, but I could read a poem. Would that be okay?
Close enough.
So he writes this, he says, I went out to the hazel wood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It became a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by name and ran, and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old and wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips and take her hands, and walk among long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. To me, that's, when we encounter this God who loves us beyond our wildest imagination, it has that effect. It knows our name. It calls us to be not necessarily more than we are. It's really who we are. Creates an image of ourself even that's large enough to live freely within. And we are captivated as much by the image of ourselves as we are of that which is calling us. And so wherever that's calling us, that's where we want to be, because we sense that our whole identity is there rather than just a mere part of it. And so Abram and Sarai, Sarai, as they originally known, their names are changed. There's another sense that God calls us by name. You will no longer be called Abram, but Abraham. You will no longer be called Sarai, but Sarah. They drop the idols, in the tradition. They smash the idols, like there is no God but God, to cite the Quran. This is the one. This is the one who knows me for who I am, who calls me into being who I am. That's where I want to be.
Our next comment really is from our online community, who says, we are eager to dive into the already occupied land issue.
Yeah, that's a good
There was a question
question
earlier online there too that addresses the same thing. It says God promises Abraham's descendants a land that is already occupied. How do we address this in today's world?
Yeah.
Liz asks that same question. Yeah.
So we go, once again, we offer the first response.
I think that question is addressed to the community at large.
Yeah.
Anybody want to comment on that?
I think on that question, there's two levels. We are so caught up in what's happening now that it really clouds the issue of what was going on in the text. And so there's a sense in which, and I don't mean this to be evasive, actually. I mean what's happening presently is so complex. And so there are some analogies there, but I think we're easily clouded. And there is a sense, if we're going to comment about what's going on today, use the text to comment about what's going on today, I think that it doesn't really work so well. In a sense, as a Christian, my comment about what's going on there today is the Jews and Muslims are enmeshed in a struggle that is quite profound and quite complex, and any advice I would give them about how to handle that has already occurred to them. and there has a sense in which many of us who live in the world as outsiders to that have to kind of bear witness to what's going on and to be ready to offer where we find insight when asked for, especially, to offer what we can see from our perspective. But the whole idea of what's going on right now has less to do with reconciliation, I think, with two different people who are fighting. It has to do with a need for reconciliation with God. And we worship the same God. and the fact that there are people who are killing each other, worshiping the same God, says that there is not reconciliation with God first, and we have to kind of deal with that, and not to cast blame. And we as Christians wrestle with that same thing as our number one issue. Now, to go back into the ancient times, it raises the thorny question: is when you have a people and that's to have a distinctive identity, how do you create that? And that's kind of the eternal question: is if God is going to act in and through an imperfect world, most people aren't going to say, you know what, God has called these people. These people claim that God has called them into a relationship here in a special way that's going to bless the world. So let's just give them, our land, or let's just let them inhabit this as with a distinct identity. It just doesn't happen that way. It happens in messy ways, and certainly that is what happened when we look at the emergence of Israel and Canaan. It was messy, but also when you look at the emergence of Canaan and Israel from an archaeological point of view, you realize that it wasn't nearly as messy as maybe it was claimed in scriptures as well. That there was actually a whole lot of the Hebrew people were actually native Canaanites who saw in the Hebrew faith a faith that resonated very strongly with their own Canaanite faith, and to such an extent that the word for God in Hebrew, El, is actually the very same word for the Canaanite high god, whose name was El. And so there's a whole lot going on there that would take up way beyond the boundaries of this program to get into, but essentially we have to recognize that God works in a messy world, and so do we, and also that things were not necessarily as violent as they may appear, have appeared. That actually a lot of people, it has a lot to do with people finding harmony together and discovering right relationship in a God that they felt was the same God. So
there's conversation online about this pretty extensively as well. Timoth says, if the God in the Noah story from last week was still learning, perhaps the God who is giving away already occupied land is still doing the same. The issue of occupied land, Lene says, applies not only to the Middle East, but we can look at it in many different places. I'm reminded of those pictures of Native Americans who say you're all illegal aliens. But even my kids, she said, in sharing space where they are, have to think about. I think that has something to do with ownership. Our idea of that we own this land somehow needs to be questioned, and some of that stuff too. But then they question, our churches can be occupied space if we aren't willing to be open and welcoming to the stranger. The promise of land is a state of mind. So there's lots of discussion about the whole metaphor of land and ownership and relationship and God and who gets what and who's privileged and who's not. So it's an open discussion.
Yeah, it is indeed. Well, we want to bring this open discussion to a head, not a close perhaps, but a head, and really that's quite an appropriate transition to the climax of our evening, which is always communion. If you happen to have bread and wine or juice and crackers, other elements at home you want to share in this meal with us, we invite you to do so at this time. Oh, and before that, pointing out
cookies.
We forgot to point out the cookies. Every week now we have cookies, and they're provided. The recipe is provided by our guests. Our cookie tonight is a Ghirardelli chocolate chip cookie
Classic
that Jacqueline Lapsley provided. This is her favorite cookie recipe. We've got that up on our Facebook page, I think, and the website.
Yes.
And so you can get cookies. What we're going to be trying to do is actually publishing these recipes in advance, and we encourage you at home to bake these yourselves, share them with friends, invite friends over to watch Darkwood Brew.
Invite us over.
And maybe share some cookies with somebody who may not even be with you, but may need a cookie, may need a brighter day. So that, Thursday morning you've got some cookies to share with people, saying, "Hey, I baked these because when I was watching Darkwood Brew." And thanks to our bakers here at Countryside Church for these. I've already had one. This is yours. I just handled it, so I guess I'm going to have to eat it.
It's all yours now.
Yeah. But getting to the more substantive food, I think that the three great faith traditions here that are represented in Abraham, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they all affirm this need for submission to one God and one God only. And that really the great question that we're always confronted by, to challenge with is our number one, when we are making important decisions, where do we get guidance? And whose will are we trying to please? And ultimately it's this one. But who is this God? If there is no God but God, and this God's will is to be followed, whose will are we submitting to then? And one of the things I appreciate about my own tradition, Christianity, is that in this meal it becomes quite clear the nature and character of this God who we are called to submit to, who we're really invited to fall in love with. It's a God who entered a very messy world, a God who sends a Messiah, Jesus, and that world breaks his body and sheds his blood. You don't get messier than that, especially after being tortured and shed and dying. And yet this is a God who nevertheless did not then bring in the next great flood, but had already promised since that flood never to wipe out humanity, to be humanity's protector. And even at the greatest extent of that relationship, the greatest testing of that relationship, continues to work with us and through us in love. And unbelievably, continues to trust our response to God's love for us. That's the only God we are called to submit to. That's the only God we are called to fall in love with, is the God who has already, from eternity, from the very beginning, in fact, before the beginning, loved us beyond what we could possibly imagine. And any other God whose love is beneath that level has no business being worshipped. The night of betrayal and desertion, Jesus takes these. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this as often as you eat of it in remembrance of me. So likewise, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me." By eating this bread and drinking this cup, we remember Christ's death. We celebrate Christ's resurrection. And we come to know down deep in our bodies the God who calls us by name in love. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. I invite you to join in the feast, the bread of life, the cup of blessing.
It's like waking up to an amazing sunrise, where time in the world stands still. It seems like the day-to-day is closing in. I saw me through the eyes of someone else, and that someone was you. That someone was you, with wonder and love pure. The journey begins with one love and a hand from above. The journey begins. Let the journey begin.
Amen. Well, thank you for joining us tonight, Mark. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And we look forward to next week when we welcome Bishop John Selders from Hartford, Connecticut, with Amistad United Church of Christ, the organizing pastor there. And John, I'm looking forward to seeing you in a couple weeks personally, too, for Darkwood Brew Unplugged in Connecticut. Until next week, my friends, may the Spirit, the Spirit of the living God, made known to us most fully in Jesus Christ our Lord, go before you to show you the way, go above you to watch over you, go behind you to push you into places you may not necessarily go yourself, maybe leaving your own Ur and going to your land of promise. Go beneath you to uphold you and uplift you, go beside you to be your strong and constant companion, and dwell within you to remind you that you are surely not alone, and you are loved, loved beyond your wildest imagination. And may the fire of God's blessing burn brightly upon you and within you, now and always. Amen.
In the middle of the forest, under the shadows of the trees, I had wandered through the darkness until the way was lost to me. But it was there I heard a calling, and it was there I found belief. It was then that I found courage in the hour of my need. And I walk on foot with a faith and trust to guide me through the darkest wood. Darkwood. In the valley of the shadows, there is nothing I shall fear, 'cause if the dark should